Welcome, everyone. Today we are diving into one of the most explosive, brilliant, and controversial ideas in the history of human thought. We are going to explore the mind of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, specifically focusing on the concepts mapped out in the work titled The Moral Inversion. Nietzsche fundamentally shatters the way we look at human goodness, tracking the historical inversion of survival logics between the so called masters and slaves. He strips away the polite veneer of civilization to reveal a psychological game driven by the will to power and its dark opposite, resentiment. Let us journey together into this intellectual deconstruction of absolute morality and see how the values we take for granted were actually born from a hidden ancient war. Think about the moral rules you grew up with. The idea that certain things are just universally, objectively good or evil. Nietzsche's genealogical method completely destroys the illusion of a given morality. Morality is not a divine, objective, or eternal truth handed down from the heavens. Instead, values are biological mechanisms. They are historical constructs created by specific psychological archetypes to ensure their own power, survival, and dominance. Imagine discovering that the rules of a competitive sport were secretly written by the losing team to ensure they could never be tackled. That is exactly what Nietzsche suggests happened to human values. To understand this, we have to look at the thinkers who tried to explain morality before Nietzsche, specifically the English utilitarian Herbert Spencer. Spencer offered a very superficial synthesis of how the concept of good came to be. Spencer argued that unegoistic, selfless actions were originally performed to help others, were perceived as useful by the recipient, and then were simply solidified by habit into the universal concept of good. Nietzsche exposes the psychological absurdity of this utilitarian premise. He asks a brilliant question: how could the beneficiaries of such vital utility simply forget the origin of this advantage? It makes no psychological sense to just forget why someone is giving you a massive survival advantage. Instead of utility, Nietzsche argues that the origin of values lies in the right of naming, which belongs exclusively to the powerful ruling classes. The concept of good did not originate with the weak people to whom goodness was shown. It originated from the pathos of distance. The noble, the powerful, and the truthful looked down from their heights and designated themselves and their actions as good. Conversely, they looked down at the common, the weak, and the lying, and labeled them as bad. Think of a powerful high school clique that decides what is cool simply because they are the ones doing it. The power to name reality belongs to those who dominate it. This brings us to the concept of master morality. In this framework, values are evaluated through the binary of noble versus despicable. For the master, the good means being strong, brave, originating, and truthful. Action is originating, spontaneous, and entirely self defining. The master affirms himself first. He joyfully says, I am good, and only as an afterthought does he designate the cowardly, petty, or passive weaklings as bad. This is a spontaneous affirmation of one's own excellence, completely free from bitterness or resentment. This master morality is deeply connected to the physiology of power and the overflowing vitality. The noble human being honors himself as a creator of values driven by self affirmation and an uncontainable excess of power. But what about compassion? The strong do actually help the weak, but Nietzsche notes they do so not out of pity. Pity is a reactive, depressing emotion. Instead, the master helps the weak out of an unstoppable impulse generated by an overabundance of power. It is the spontaneous discharge of excess vitality, much like a cup that is so full of water it simply overflows onto the saucer below. But the world is not only made of the strong, we must examine the psychology of the oppressed. For the weak, their reality is defined by physical impotence. They have an inability to act outwardly or exact physical revenge against the masters. Because they hate this impenetrable wall, their survival instincts and aggressive drives suffer a blockage. Unable to act outwardly, the survival instincts of the slave class are forced underground. shifting deeply into the realm of psychology and imagination. Just like a river that is dammed up and forced to violently carve a new, hidden cave system, their physical impotence ferments into psychological cunning. This subterranean shift gives birth to a terrifying and brilliant mechanism known as ressentiment. Ressentiment is the psychological brewing of venomous hatred within the weak against the strong. It starts with the input of impotence and suffering, acts through the catalyst of imaginary revenge, because the weak cannot discharge their anger physically, and results in a venomous desire to pull down the strong. This reactive emotion is the subterranean birthplace of modern morality, eventually becoming highly creative and giving birth to completely inverted values. To see how this works, we have to look at the architecture of evaluation, comparing the active to the reactive. Master morality is spontaneous. It originates from within with the primary concept of self affirmation. I am good. The secondary concept, bad, is merely an afterthought applying to the pathetic weaklings. Slave morality, however, is entirely reactive. It originates from an external stimulus. The slave first looks at the powerful master and defines him as evil. This condemnation of the powerful is the primary concept. Only subsequently does the slave define his own weakness as good, reasoning that if the master is evil, then the exact opposite of the master must be good. This reactive logic triggers the slave revolt in morality, resulting in the transvaluation of values. This is perhaps the greatest psychological coup in human history. Through a brilliant linguistic inversion, the weak cunningly rebrand the master's overflowing vitality, nobility, and strength as evil. At the same time, they rebrand their own passive impotence, their cowardice, their submission, and their sheer inability to take revenge as good. They take the master's values and flip them completely upside down, turning weakness into a moral high ground. This requires us to fundamentally redefine life itself, contrasting Darwinian survival with Nietzsche's will to power. You are likely familiar with the series of Charles Darwin, where life is seen as a passive struggle for mere self preservation and a reactive adaptation to the environment. Nietzsche firmly rejects this passive Darwinian view. For Nietzsche, the ultimate driver is the will to power, meaning life is an active, aggressive drive to expand, incorporate, overcome, and conquer. Mere self preservation is only an indirect consequence of this aggressive will to power. 类中 does not just want to survive, it desperately wants to dominate. When the human animal with this aggressive will to power is finally tamed and enclosed by society, its natural aggressive instincts, like hunting, cruelty, and destruction, can no longer be discharged outwardly. Society builds the heavy walls of peace and custom because these wild instincts are forced backward and turned inward against the self. Humanity experiences the internalization of man. Man begins to torture himself, and this inversion creates bad conscience, guilt, and profound psychological self loathing. Imagine a wild tiger trapped in a tiny cage. Unable to hunt, it begins to obsessively bite and tear at its own fur. Into this psychological cage steps a fascinating figure, the ascetic priest. The priest institutionalizes this self torture. He becomes the shepherd of the sick herd, preserving the weak by giving their suffering a meaning. But his cure is actually a poison. The priest weaponizes the concepts of sin and guilt to manage humanity into a sick, manageable, and self loathing herd. He creates a vicious cycle of suffering and guilt, offering his own diagnosis to the tamed herd. It is your own fault. It is your sin. It is like a doctor who secretly keeps you slightly sick just so you will always rely on his medicine. The ultimate tool of this priestly class is Christian pity, which acts as the pathogen of egalitarianism. The slave revolt crystallized into this morality of pity, which elevates suffering and weakness as the ultimate virtues. Before this infection, strength was celebrated, and suffering was just a byproduct of greatness. Post infection, strength is treated as a sin, suffering is deemed holy, and the strong are made to feel deeply ashamed of their own power. Pity is a poison that levels society and depresses the vital instincts of the strong. However, Nietzsche's dialectic is beautifully complex, and he acknowledges a profound dialectical tension here. While slave morality was venomous and sick, this priestly resentment was not entirely negative. By forcing all of those aggressive instincts inward, the human soul was made deep, intricate, and intellectually rich. Before the ascetic priest and this internalization, the human soul was shallow. Suffering and intense self reflection burst the deep inner world of humanity. It is much like how the most profound and moving art is often burst directly from a creator's agonizing personal trauma. In fact, this dark process is the catalyst for the birth of modern intellect. The cunning, patience, and psychological refinement born from weakness, guilt, and resentment ultimately catalyzed the development of modern human civilization and higher intellect. Impotence burst cunning, guilt burst self reflection, resentment burst ideological innovation. Because of this agonizing subterranean shift, we became what Nietzsche might call the interesting animals. We are intelligent precisely because we were made to suffer and turn inward upon ourselves. Yet, we must remember the universal mechanics at play. The will to power is not merely a human psychological trait, it is the fundamental mechanic of all living cells and social structures. When a cell encounters a lesser mass, its protoplasm extends to envelop it, encoding and assimilating the lesser mass to overcome and utilize its energy. Life inherently seeks to assimilate, incorporate, and overcome. Therefore, egalitarianism violates the most basic physical reality of organic matter. Equality goes against the very cellular logic of life itself. The ultimate driver of all this organic and psychological reality is Selbstüberwindung, or self-overcoming. Life is a constant process of self-overcoming. The goal is not merely to exist, but to elevate, command, and create. While Darwinian survival is entirely reactive and focused on adapting to the environment, the will to power is entirely active, expanding, and dominating. It is a drive to climb the golden staircase of your own potential, constantly overcoming your previous self to achieve greater heights, much like a legendary athlete who refuses to rest until they have broken their own world records. Understanding this allows us to see through the hypocrisy of the herd. We can offer a diagnostic summary of egalitarian morality. The illusion of equality is actually a mechanism to drag down the exceptional to the level of the mediocre. The illusion of selflessness is a disguised will to power, utilized by the weak to gain the moral high ground. And the illusion of pity is a depressant that spreads suffering rather than curing it. Egalitarian morality is not an objective good. It is simply the most successful psychological weapon ever deployed by the weak against the strong. This brings us to the call for revaluation. We must transition from the face of the lion, which destroys illusions, to the face of the child, which creates entirely new values. It is absolutely necessary to dismantle the hypocritical moral structures of the herd. Only by clearing away the suffocating ruins of resentiment can the spontaneous, joyful will to power of the strong flourish once again. We must break the chains of guilt and usher in a post-moral world where vitality is celebrated rather than punished. In this post-moral world, we arrive at the concept of the Übermensch, or the overman. Humanity is not a final destination, but a bridge. As Nietzsche famously declares, man is a rope tied between beast, and overman a rope over an abyss. By overcoming the sickness of guilt and the venom of resentment, the human spirit is freed to create its own values, affirming life in its absolute totality. We are called to leave behind the reactive, venomous morality of the past, to embrace our profound depths, and to joyfully become the active creators of our own grand future. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the very foundation of our values.